reasons today, and two of them are here in the room with us. So let's turn got the music for us. But we're just excited for a lot of different reasons. This is a wonderful evening, and I know lots of you are watching online, so we're excited to welcome you to Mahogany Books as well. My name is Ramona Young, and I'm one of the owners of Mahogany Books, along with my husband, Derek Young, who's on the other side of the camera here, making sure we're good to go. But we want to welcome you to an amazing conversation with two legends. You didn't just get one. We got two legends in the building tonight. And so I'm excited to have the conversation, or be a part of this conversation rather. But more importantly, excited for you all to be a part of this conversation about a new book that just came out by the amazing Ben Jealous. It's called Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. I have to look so to make sure I get the title. It's a nice, healthy, full mouthful, but I want people to know what the title is. If you don't have the book yet, you need to get the book. It's available at mahoganybooks.com. It's on our homepage. You can see it there immediately, and we'll have it shipped to your home. But without further ado, let's get into it. I would love to introduce Mr. Hilary Shelton, who is our moderator for the evening. And I don't want to mess up anything, so I'm going to read some of this off of your bio, Mr. Shelton. Mr. Shelton presently serves as the National Advisor of Governance and Policy. In this capacity, Mr. Shelton is responsible for advocating the federal public policy issue agenda of the oldest, largest, and most widely recognized civil rights organization in the United States to the U.S. government. Mr. Shelton's government affairs portfolio includes crucial issues such as affirmative action, equal employment protection, access to quality education, and a host, and when I say a host of other things, a host of other things. Please help me welcome Mr. Hilary Shelton as our moderator this evening. Welcome, Mr. Shelton. And I just learned a great little secret. He's one of our customers that are in a costume store. So thank you for just supporting us in a dream that my husband and I had. So thank you.
Thank you for providing a whole lot of Christmas presents.
Hey, a whole lot of Christmas presents. Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you for coming out today. It's an honor. And the man of the hour, the author of the hour, is none other than Mr. Ben Jealous, and who's been just an amazing person from afar in my life. You don't even know this, but from the NAACP perspective, many, many years ago, I was part of the NAACP back in college, and I was just looking the other day and found my NAACP membership card. It said 1990 or 1983, 93 on it, so we won't date that, but it's just been an honor to be a part of that organization, to know that you have led that organization as well. But right now, you are serving as the president of People for the American Way, a progressive advocacy group, and the New York Times bestselling author of Reach, 40 Black Men Speak on Living, Leading, and Succeeding. Mr. Jealous is also a civil rights leader, scholar, former journalist, and philanthropist. He is a former Democratic nominee for governor of Maryland, former national president and CEO of the NAACP, and former executive director of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. But tonight, he is an amazing author. And without further ado, Mr. Ben Jealous, please come up.
Well, thank you to each of you for being here tonight. Thank you to my brothers in Kappa Alpha Psi for being here tonight. Happy birthday, brothers. And thank you to Mahogany Books. I thought I would start just by reading a bit from my book, and then we'll get into it. Absolutely. As a child, I soaked up my grandmother's stories like cornbread soaks up butter mixed with maple syrup. My grandmother, like every woman we knew of before her in her bloodline, was the family griot. She was the one who told stories over and over while she cooked, while we ate, while we played cards, while we sat on the beach. She was a veteran statewide leader in the war on poverty and a local soldier in the civil rights movement. Usually she told her tales and those of her parents and grandparents as a form of instruction. Like an old general, she didn't expect you to fight in the same ways as she had, or they had. Her faith, however, was that if you knew how she fought her battles, then you would find yourself better prepared in a future fight. Sometimes, however, Her statements were riddles she hoped you would be inspired to solve. Like the one about colonial rebellions. Other times she made claims that were ridiculous on their face and then confounded you with her insistence they not be contradicted. Never forget our people were always free. She'd offer as a diversion from the subject at hand. She often seemed to insert it as an offhand closer to a conversation about some sensitive aspect of our family's history and slavery, about which she did not want to hear more discussion. When I was a kid, it made my brain hurt. It just didn't make any sense. When I was a teenager, I decided to challenge her head on. What are you talking about, Mimi? 3 of your grandparents were born into slavery. The 4th was a white man your own sister says raped one of your grandmothers. Who was free? The rapist. She stared at me like she pitied me. She would never say a curse word, but by the look on her face, I'd say she thought me either an idiot or an asshole. Ultimately, I relented. Challenging it seemed as cruel and futile as an atheist trying to convince a devout nun that Mary wasn't a virgin. Historically, the women in many families and the griots in the West African tradition don't just hand down important stories. They hand down traditions, religion, recipes for success, and the peculiar convictions and articles of faith that make a family, and a tribe. This, I reasoned, must just be one of the latter two. My book, thank you. And thank you for being here tonight. If you're online, go to mahoganybooks.com and buy your books there. It's best to benefit our own folks. This book, Never Forget Our People Were Always Free, was my attempt, because my grandmother was dying. I mean, just chronologically, she was 103 when I started it. She was 105 when I finished it, and she died about 3 weeks later. And my grandmother, you have to understand, was a force of nature. I mean, she had been, if you're Delta, she had been in the Baltimore City chapter with Mrs. Murphy, one of the founders. If you're a Black woman involved in supporting the arts, she co-founded the Pierians, which are a multi-city group of Black women who support the arts. If you're in politics, she was the mentor to Barbara Mikulski. You want to make Senator Mikulski cry, you mention me anytime. She taught her social work. And when we were on StoryCorps, somebody asked her, my mom asked her, have you ever been afraid of anyone? And she said, I don't know. I'll have to think about that. But this conviction that she would deliver these words, never forget our people were always free. I just had a sense if I couldn't figure out what the heck she meant when she was alive, I would never know, and it would bother me when God willing, is 100. And so I went digging. And I kept running into barriers, but I kept finding friends. As I talk about this story, there's another place where I talk about my mom's Black community mental health center she started in Seaside, California. A white guy walks in one day, because it's a federally funded health clinic. At the end of the day, it was started in a Black community for that community, but that's going to serve anybody who walks in. And they put culture, they won awards and been cited by different institutions and agencies for putting culture at the center of therapy. So if you're Muslim or you're Jewish or you're Christian, they might ask your pastor or your imam or your rabbi to be part of your therapy, for instance. The intake's a little longer than most places. This guy walks in, and he's getting annoyed at the intake desk. He's like, I'm white. I'm like Wonder Bread. Like, I'm just white. Like, no religion, no ethnicity. I'm just white. And then he makes this sound. And my mom was the chair of the clinic. The president of the clinic is an old Black Panther turned social worker turned head of the NAACP, Mel Mason, president of Monterey Branch. And Mel's like, just stop. I'll take the brother. Just give him to me. So they're doing therapy, and this guy keeps making this sound. And Mel's like, that's a word. The guy's like, no, it's just a sound. My daddy made that sound. My granddaddy made that sound. I'm sure my great-grand, but it's just a sound that men make. He's like, no, you're saying some words. And, well, Google's fascinating. You can take a photo of a tree. It'll tell you the genus, the type, the species. You can put in phonetic sounds, and it'll tell you what words they are, what language, and what the meaning is. And the sound that guy was making was a curse in Old Irish. And Mel's a very dignified brother, like the NAACP president, Black Panther type. You're like, you don't mess with Mel. And so Mel read that he was like, he said that to me. Oh man! So he wrote it down. He waited in therapy till the next time the guys made the sound. He's like, stop right there. He's like, do you know what you're saying? The guy says, I'm making that sound. He said, no. He said, put that sound into Google. Those are words. You know the words you're saying? He said, well, I'm very glad to hear that because those words mean this. Never say that to another living human being. Do not say it to me again. He said, and those words are Old Irish. And you said that your whole paternal line made that sound. Well, that means y'all are Irish. So your job for the rest of your therapy is to figure out what it means to be Irish and what that means to you. And this man who felt so utterly disconnected from most of humanity, suddenly felt tethered to the globe and was part of a diaspora that had music, that had culture, that had tradition, and it grounded him and it centered him and it helped him. So back to my grandma, she keeps saying these words that don't make any sense. And her DNA had confounded us. We'd gone to Africa, we'd gone to Ancestry.com, they had told us a lot. 23andMe had told us a lot. We went to African Ancestry, and folks at Howard helped me with my grandfather. He descends from the Lemba tribe. But my grandmother, they're just like, look, her X chromosome is Asian. It probably means she's Native American. That's as far as we can go over here at African Ancestry. So I go to Henry Louis Gates Jr. at Harvard. And Dr. Gates spends 2 years with that X chromosome. He also presumed that we were Native American, because if you're black with an X chromosome from Asia, typically means you're Native American. No mutations matched. He did a global search. Turns out that we descend from the Polynesian founders of Madagascar. Those folks showed up as pirates. Those folks are still pirates. I want to go meet them. I got to first figure out how to not end up being somebody's ransom. Because I want to know the pirates, It's fascinating. I got to come home to my baby girl. I was like, guess what, baby? Grandma's stories, because, light-skinned black folks from Southern Virginia all think they just think of Pocahontas. I said, baby, the Pocahontas, no. She's like, but aren't we Indians? I said, no. I said, baby, we're pirates. She goes, oh, that's really cool. So you say, okay, well, his stuff echoed down the paternal line from Ireland. Ours is echoing down the maternal line. And it doesn't make any sense for any generation that was enslaved or the children of slaves. But the first person to show up had been a pirate. Only 17 slave ships ever come from Madagascar to the United States. 16 out of 17 are piloted by known European pirates. All the historians agree those slave ships were sort of informal slave ships. They weren't planned slave ships. There was a battle going on between European pirates and African pirates, and the Africans would lose. Occasionally they would enslave the able-bodied people in the village to try to break the rebellion. That's why they're so certain she's a pirate. Well, what would a pirate woman say to her children born into slavery and her grandchildren born into slavery? But never forget, our people were always free. Mm-hmm. And how would that sister say that? She would say that as inspiration to at the very least understand that if freedom was your history, then freedom must be your destiny, and that's your responsibility. And then I started thinking about the sisters on that line. I was like, well, my grandma's grandma ran away from slavery, and her mother bamboozled the white clerk during Jim Crow to let her go sit in the back of the clerk's office and write birth certificates by hand because she was so angry that black folks were treated like chattel and we didn't get birth certificates. That's why all her children's birth certificates are in her own hand, and every other person that counted. And my mama, well, she sued her high school when she was 12 so she could desegregate it when she was 15. Like, something's in the water. My mom got more metaphysical. She said, well, when I went to the Peace Corps, I ended up in the Philippines, I felt kind of at home with Polynesian people. I was like, ain't that much DNA left, Mom, but, there's probably something to it. was healing for me to find out that my grandfather's folks came from a specific people in Sierra Leone and what their character was. It helped me understand perhaps why his whole family, his father didn't just have 2 jobs, his dad had like 5 jobs. Was so peripatetic. It didn't, but it also really helped to connect that my grandmother may not have been crazy. She may have just simply been doing what we do in families, simply repeating some foolishness our parents said without critical thinking. But it was healing to know that at some point in history it may have actually made sense. And that's my hope in this book, is that, we all kind of listen a bit deeper to each other. We interrogate our own history relentlessly to figure out more. I do believe that we can get to more of it, that we can heal this nation, but I also believe that part of that is moving up beyond the way that race obliterates fortune. For Black folks, for white folks, for anybody who finds themselves suddenly pushed into a box defined by color. Thank you. Let's get into it.
Ben, I'm excited. I'm excited about right now. I'm excited about your book. But I'm also excited because you see how white my hair is. I knew Ben Jealous when he was a college student doing an internship right here in Washington.
And we thought he was old because his hair was all gray then. Brother was like 29 with a full head of gray hair. We're like, why did they send the old man to talk to us? What did we do wrong?
So absolutely. Well, look, I got to watch you go through a lot of transitions, man. At that time, we were celebrating the 30th anniversary of the March on Washington. Ben was actually working, no surprises here, for the AFL-CIO for the summer. Another labor organizer, ready to do his thing, learning what he could learn and whatnot, bringing the brilliance that he had then, that raw brilliance that he brought us from. Now, you were in New York going to school at
Columbia
University,
which is why I had a job.
Very
Because we were the first students kicked out of college at Columbia for politics since SDS. And there were a lot of SDS folks working for AFL, and they were so vain. They're like, wow, you must be something to be kicked out, because the last people they kicked out was us, and that was a long time ago. I was like, no, I'm just angry, but okay.
Which basically says, I want to kind of build you up to where we are now.
By the way, also in that room was Stacey Abrams.
Yes, indeed.
And Derek Johnson, who runs the NAACP now. We were all linked together by the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which is a Black labor organization.
Absolutely.
Stacey I'm already cussing. Stacey was a badass man.
Oh, no question. No question. All of them were. And one of the great things was, and you all know Walter Fauntroy. Walter Fauntroy was responsible for the nuts and bolts of putting that whole march and everything together. And he turns to me during my years working for the United Methodist Church. Matter of fact, I see my friend Mark Harris from the United Methodist Church sitting back here right now as well. So he turned and said, Hilary, see if the Methodists will loan you to us to do the youth and college components of all of this. Now, I'm a U.S. Student Association alumni and everything else and whatnot. So liberal troublemakers like me as well. So I was excited about what we were going to do together because they did a wonderful job.
You also just appreciate having a brother like him in the room. It's too much stress on Hillary. Come on.
As they wrote, absolutely. So there was that. Now, Ben, I realized there was something going on with Ben even then, because he asked the hard questions, and after he answered them and whatnot, he just looked at you for a while. He wanted to get that after experience from you, whatever expressions you had on your face and issues along those lines. So that was the first time we got together. The second time, Ben came back as an intern and worked for the Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. A less than exciting issue for so many, but one that was truly important for us, and Ben understood why he had to take that position as well. He knew that if you're African American, you're more likely to get executed. But he knew how unfair it was, but how inhumane it was to have in the first place. Did a wonderful job for us then. One of the interesting pivots then was I chaired the board at the time. He and I went out to lunch as Ben was kind of putting together a lot of our circulars and other information we were working on and whatnot, the monthly newsletters and so forth, consolidating things, just simply making them better. He had this look on his face like he was just a little worried about something. We finished eating lunch and whatnot, and he said, look, Hilary, He said, now, I got the Rhodes Scholarship, and I'm on my way to England, I think, but I'm not sure I want to go. And I said, Ben, why? He said, because I feel like I'm on my path. I spent that time with the labor unions. I spent this time with the coalition to abolish the death penalty and whatnot. And I just don't feel like I want to leave this one now. And I turned to him and said, Ben, don't worry about it. I said, look, recommendation. Go to England, get everything you can out of it, bring all those new skills and understandings and strategies back with you. You'll be an even more effective organizer coming back than you were going. And indeed, that's exactly what he did. So Ben came back, for those of you who don't know, decided he was going to help out the black newspapers. Well, let me back up a little bit. So yeah, the black newspapers, because he ended up writing for the Amsterdam News.
Jackson Advocate.
And the Jackson Advocate as well. So from Mississippi to New York, Ben was learning what he needed to learn along the way and writing about it in a way that helped the rest of us out as we moved in that process too. Very proud of him as he moved in that direction as well. But then he decided he was going to organize all the black newspapers and came back and worked with the National Newspaper Publishers Association. Ben, I've not forgotten. During that time, for those of you who may be newer to this world, we didn't always have the internet, y'all. And so in our communities, we depended on those black newspapers to tell it to us straight. And Ben had already experienced working for two of the very important ones, one in New York and one in Jackson, Mississippi. And now he was ready to help them all organize, creating their first newsline services on the internet. So not only were they beginning to share stories with each other from all over the country, but they were also able to print each other's stories from all over the country as well.
And we brought them online as a group. When I started, there were 8 black newspapers online. 2 years later, I'd organized 80 of them to come online.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. So all that was very much a part of it and whatnot, and very exciting to me. And of course, Ben, you have to look back. Here's one thing I am excited about. I'll leave with my little lesson, and I'm going to get to some questions to Ben. The thing I'm excited about is I had a great time working with him as an intern when he was about 19 to 20 years old. And then on from there every step of the way. The lesson in that for me was, be careful how you treat even the least of these, because they may end up being your boss. Which he was.
That's true. I mean, I signed your paycheck. That's how far as it went. Yes.
Absolutely. But let me say the thing I was also very grateful for is I knew what your experiences were, your backgrounds, your commitments were all along the way there. And very well, I visited with his folks in Monterey, California. My only disappointment is I didn't get a chance to go back to the Monterey Jazz Festival.
Yeah.
Work that one out as well as
Third weekend in September, coming to you.
We'll definitely, I'll call a friend to see if we can get some of those good seats and whatnot. All that being said, Ben, there's so many things you could have talked about as you write through, so many places to start. Why did you start where you did as you were crafting this book?
It's funny. The first chapter of the book starts me training Dave Chappelle how to shoot on the eve of Y2K in the cornfields of Southwest Ohio. My father, Bill Chappelle, grew up in D.C., down the street from Congresswoman Norton. He was a legend, man. He went to Brown at 15. People underestimate Dave. He makes so many dumb assumptions based on color. It's ridiculous. And they don't look at Dave Chappelle and say, oh, his dad must have gone to Brown in 1955 at 15 years old, and his mom must have been the first black woman ordained in the Unitarian Church. But both those things are true. And here we were, man. It was literally the eve of the start of the century. And that's why I started there, because I could not think of a day in the century when it did not feel like somebody was trying to tear this country apart. And the first hint I got was we get done seeing Dave's new ranch home. It was a wild trip through security that night. It was totally wild. That's in the book. I'll let you enjoy that. But we get to Dave's house, see his new ranch home, and he goes, oh, dude didn't buy me a gun. And I was like, Dave, dude can't buy you a gun. Like, you got to do that for yourself, man. It's like, gotta go buy the gun. He's like, well, come on, man. We're going to Kmart. I said, now this is Beaver Creek, Ohio. This is right across from the Walmart where Johnny Crawford would be killed 20 years in the future buying a Red Ryder BB gun. And everybody's on high alert. And I'm like, Dave, I was like, man, let's just talk about this. And he's like, oh, step outside. I was like, all right. So we go to the porch. He's like, what do you see over there? I was like, cornfields. He's like, over there. I was like, cornfield over there, cornfield. He said, how many brothers do you think own them cornfields? I was like, none. He's like, precisely. He's like, I don't know how it is back home. He's like, but I'll tell you, out here, these evangelical preachers have been preaching for a year that the Armageddon's coming on. The year, tomorrow, Ben, it's not just the end of the year, the decade, the century. No, Ben, it's the end of the millennium. And they say it'll be Armageddon. And these evangelical preachers out here, they describe it as a race war. I said, yeah, but like, there's a 99% chance that they're wrong. He said, yes, and there's a 1% chance that they're right. And should they be right, wouldn't you feel better if we had a gun? And I was like, hey, you don't know how to shoot a gun. He's like, but you do. I was like, well, yeah. He's like, well, then you're going to train all the brothers tonight. And I started there because that's where the century started. What gives me hope is that every American century tends to start in a darker place than it ends. It tends to get real crazy in the middle. That's what we're headed into. We pull it together in the end. And I wanted to remind us that no matter how dark this period feels, it's always darkest before dawn, and I believe that's what we're moving into. We will move out of it into the dawn before the end of the century.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, I appreciate you pointing that light on Dave Chappelle since he's so considered so controversial these days. Among other things, another fascinating story for me.
Let me just say that too. And Norman Lear would say that if he was here too. Lenny Bruce, George Carlin, Richard Pryor. Thank God for comedians who will say the things that nobody else will say, if only to lance the boil so we can just start to heal as a society. Dave is a prophet. We were, and he talks about his own people. Go back and watch his stuff, man. The things he says about Sojourner Truth. I'd be run out of D.C. if I said that. But he's a comedian. That's the role of a comedian in a society. Man, we were on the stage, man. So we were in the club. There's a club over here at Connecticut Avenue. There's a comedy club. Forgive me for forgetting the name. It's in a brick building. We were in the basement. Well, DC Sniper was going on. DC Sniper was going on. And I'm known in the Chitlin circuit of comedy as Chappelle's Puerto Rican bodyguard. Because we started out at the Boston Comedy Club, and when you light-skinned in New York, you were just Puerto Rican. And the fact that you don't speak Spanish when you're Gen X, does not mean anything. Because the ones who came over in the 50s told their kids not to speak Spanish because they wanted them to assimilate. So they're like, you told, but that just proves it, brother. And when you're a big athlete, you're just the bodyguard. So he would use me as a foil in his jokes going back to when we were 18 years old. And we're over in that comedy club and the DC Sniper thing is happening. And Chappelle says, in the middle of a different joke on a different subject, he says, Ben, I just figured it out. I'll figure out what, Dave? Because Sniper's got to be black. At the time, everything was, these are white men. Remember that? He said, white men. He said, they got to be black. I said, now I know he's some part of the routine. So I go, why, Dave? He says, think about it, man. White, this is the second weekend in a row they haven't killed nobody. He said, white psychopaths don't take off the weekend? I said, bro, that's when they do their best work. Boston Strangler, Jack the Ripper, best work Friday, Saturday night. He's like, what a brother. Oh, he might just take off the weekend. Like real talk. So Dave's always been controversial. And I would just say that there is a value to having comedians who are courageous, who insult all of us, and yet get all of us to laugh at the same time.
Well, the man is brilliant as well. Let me say that the NAACP was in a fight with Hollywood. We'd opened a Hollywood bureau because they weren't hiring black folks behind the cameras and not very much in front of the cameras. And in front of the cameras, we were limited to just a couple of different characters, a couple of different roles and whatnot. On BET, you may remember these days, BET had a news show. The news talk show. And Dave had been invited to come on and debate D.L. Hughley. Because Hughley felt like Hollywood was giving him everything he wanted, but he was one in a million, literally. I get a phone call from Ben Jealous saying, hey, brother, I'm walking through Central Park. I got Dave Chappelle standing next to me. He's going to be debating D.L. Hughley.
No, he wasn't debating DL. He was debating a Yale professor who had written a book called The N-Word because Comedy Central felt awkward about Dave using the N-Word. And let me tell you how it ended, because Helen gave him good advice, of which he took very little. And then he's debating all these professors who are outraged that he's using the N-word on television. And Dave looked at all of them and he said, talked a lot about the N-word today, but forgive me, please. What are the 5 biggest problems facing our community? They listed housing and jobs. He said, so what you're saying is if I stop using the N-word, all those problems disappear. And the professor had nothing to say. He's brilliant.
No, absolutely.
Let's get into the book.
Oh, very good, right? So that moves me to a couple of things to think about racism in those terms. As we were talking about, whether it's the N-word, Hollywood, black folks have opportunities, racism. As we're thinking about that, there are 3 big lies you talk about around
Yes.
this. Talk to us a little bit about that.
You know, I'll get to the biggest one in a second. I think the one that's sort of like we've all encountered at some point. I remember in college, people would say, you know, racist had some bumper sticker, like, we knew it would cost us this much, we would have picked cotton ourselves. Like, no, you wouldn't have, but okay. It's the Archie Bunker myth that the people who paid the price for desegregation were white folks. They paid a price. They were blockbusters. There were folks who would come to white families and say, you know, a black family just moved in. Your housing prices are going to go through the floor. You better sell your house for half what you paid for it, or you're going to be in trouble. And then they would sell the house back for full price to black folks. They made money coming and going. They exploited everybody. White folks paid a price. That's true. But you know who else paid a price? It wasn't just Archie Bunker. It was Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson. We lost black businesses by the thousands. That's why the National Baptist Convention tried to get Dr. King to slow down. And Dr. King was right not to slow down. We have to recognize that we all pay a price for progress. And it was deep on both sides. Another lie that they tell us is that racism only hurts black folks. It only hurts people of color. What Dr. King was trying to get us to understand, remember, Dr. King was not assassinated in a desegregation battle. Dr. King was assassinated organizing the Poor People's Campaign. Dr. King was as much of a student of Frederick Douglass as we are of Dr. King. Frederick Douglass had learned how to organize, really brought the model for the American Civil Rights Movement, as I discussed in the book, from Northern Ireland. He had gone over there at the invitation of Irish Protestants who were abolitionists. Douglass develops a bromance with a Catholic priest organizing a mass movement against colonialism on a penny a year membership. And what he understood, what he saw there, what he saw in Baltimore, all the white poverty, you still see a lot of white poverty in Baltimore. What Dr. King understood was that racism was part of a colonial strategy to divide groups so they would not unite to demand their due. Ultimately, at the end of the day, yes, black people are hurt in special and horrible ways. Cousin Damon here, we had an issue with the cops just yesterday. You know, taking nothing away from our people's experience. It is also true, as Dr. King tried to get us to understand, that when you divide groups at the base of our economy, both groups suffer. That was his point in his letter from Birmingham jail when he said to his jailer, oh man, you get paid that much? Well, you should join the movement too. And so it turns out that a purpose of racism from the very beginning, when it changed our society, I'll get that with the big line. Purpose of racism was to actually maintain extreme wealth at the expense of the masses. If you accept that, then it follows that numerically, more whites are hurt than blacks by the poverty that racism traps people in. Because there are 16 million and change whites in poverty, and there are 8 million and change blacks in poverty. And we have to teach our kids that. But the big lie, the big lie is, man, it's always been this way, so it's always going to be this way. And that lie, the author, if you will, who taught me that was the co-author of Black Power himself, Charles V. Hamilton. He taught me Politics 101 at Columbia University, first semester. And Professor Hamilton, it was the last day of political science, and he's like, y'all, it's the last day. You can ask me whatever you want. No question, whatever. No questions, too dumb, whatever. I've always been a little bit of a class clown. So I raised my hand and said, yes, Mr. Jealous, what's your question? I said, well, political science, sir. Heard a lot of politics. Where's the science? And he was a little offended because of Black Power. If you go back through it, there's all these arcane graphs and stuff. That's all Charles Hamilton. And so he liked to believe there was some science. He said, no, Mr. Jealous said, I don't know how to prove that to you. He said, I will tell you this, though. Politics has a lot in common with physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You can call that Bush, Clinton, Clinton, Bush, Bush, Obama, Obama, Trump. He said, and something in motion will return to its original state. And I was like slavery? He said, kind of, but not what you're thinking. He said, Americans only remember what they've seen on a screen. Back then it was Roots, now it's Django, 12 Years a Slave. He said, invariably what shows up on the screen about slavery was slavery at the end. He said, brother, never forget, before there were slave rebellions, there were colonial rebellions. My grandma used to say that, so now he had my attention. He said, think about it. He said, the earliest rebellions were not just slaves, then they were European indentured servants and African slaves rebelling together. He said, that's where we're headed. And what does that mean? When you do the chronology of race in America, for the first 100 years or so, the American experiment in British terms and United States terms starts around 1620, 1619. From there to 1720 or so, the definition of race was the same as it had been in Europe since the 1100s. When the word raza comes into Italian, it means genus or type, or as applied to people, it means tribe or nation. People bound by geography. And yes, tribes can hate each other. They can think the other one less. They also understand that they're all people at the end of the day. And so it was. Slaves picked up in African ports. Barbara Fields, the historian in Columbia, won a McCarthy Genius Award for this research, first documented, I think, in the 80s. Slaves picked up in the 1600s and delivered to America were listed as men and women from different ports in Africa, members of different nations in Africa. But after the early 1700s, we are listed simply as Negroes, along with cattle, like animals, like something less than human. What happened? Well, a couple things happened. One, folks in England were feeling themselves with the rise of science, and they were trying to order all of God's creation from the bug to the superhuman, and they put us as the subhuman. But the other thing was that colonists were struggling, the colonial overlords and ultimately the king were struggling with a failure to stop the European indentured servants and the African slaves from coming together and rebelling. Military responses weren't quite working. They worked for a time, but then they would rebel again. They passed new laws. That had some effect, but they would rebel again. Culture eats management for lunch every day. Anybody who's ever run an organization gets that. Management wasn't working so good for them, so they tried culture. Literally, a new definition to the word race, this new mindset that race would become a color cast in America. Whites at the top, Negroes at the bottom. Negro meaning black, of course. And my point is, anything that we've done, we can undo. But my other point, and this gets into the big kind of surprise in the book for me. is that there is a magnetism between working people that keeps drawing them back, actually more often than we were taught as children, across color lines, in the interest of creating a better future for all the children. And that's ultimately the physics that I put my faith in. That, you can fool people for a while, but you can't fool them all the time. And eventually people will get back to understanding that if we just come together, things accelerate much faster.
Excellent. I want to do two things right now. One is I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm going to take a walk out into the audience, because you all get to ask questions too. The thing about what you want to ask is kind of pop your hand.
I always do want to go for Winfrey.
Hey, absolutely. I still watch your show. Your book sums up racism really in three major components, what you just pretty much shared with us. But in all of this, raising the problems and how deeply it is interwoven into our society and so many other societies, quite frankly, our world, you still believe that we can beat it.
Yeah, and it has to do as much with what we've learned through our own lives, our reading of history, and also what's simply not taught. I knew that my grandmother's grandfather, Edward David Bland, had been a statesman in Virginia. I was told he was a Reconstruction statesman. But the dates didn't really line up, because Reconstruction pretty much falls apart in 1876 with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. And he didn't start serving until about 1880. There was a gap where I think we are often taught that first there was Reconstruction and then there was Jim Crow. And they blur over the fact that there was a gap of some years in between. And they were tumultuous years. So I started digging into this guy. I heard he was involved in founding Virginia State somehow. I wanted to know what that was about. What I ran into blew my mind. He was the leader of the Black Republicans in Virginia around 1880. They were, of course, the progressive, the radical party then. They had set up free public schools. The free public schools benefited all working people, black and white, of course. 1876, the Confederates are reenfranchised. By 1880, the terror of the Klan had been unleashed for 4 years. By 1881, the plantation owners are feeling themselves, and they're saying boldly they will destroy the public schools, they will shut them down. And they say, well, why will you do that? And they say, well, because we cannot afford the federal Civil War debt we're forced to pay and the public schools, so we will shut down the schools. And white working people form a new party called the Readjusters. And their demand, quite simply, is readjust the terms of that debt so we can keep our public schools. And their leader in Virginia, interestingly, is a railroad magnate. And before he was a railroad magnate, he was a Confederate general. And when he was a Confederate general, the whites thought him the second coming of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee said he was General William B. Mahone was the only man fit to succeed him. And the blacks thought him their equivalent of General Custer, a war criminal. The Battle of the Crater, ultimately a black regiment is told to surrender because they've clearly lost the battle and they want to preserve these soldiers' lives. They're ordered to surrender, and they surrender, and Mahone massacres all of them. Fast forward 15 years in the future, Mahone is leading a political party whose number one purpose is to preserve the free public schools that the Reconstruction statesmen started. And my grandmother's grandfather apparently looks at him and says, like a war criminal isn't a bad thing to have on your side if he agrees with your number one objective and you're fighting the Klan. So he reaches out to him and they form an alliance. And my grandmother's grandfather leads blacks into the Readjusters. And Virginia ends up having a majority black party. That's how many voters he led in. A majority black party with significant white representation, led by a former Confederate general Freeman, takes over the Virginia government, the governorship, both U.S. senatorships, because they control both houses of the legislature as well. And in a few short years, they radically expand Virginia Tech to make it the working person's rival to UVA. They create Virginia State, the first public HBCU south of the Mason-Dixon. Before Bowie, before Copley, before Morgan, there was Virginia State. They saved the free public schools as they said they would. They abolished the public whipping post that was still being used exclusively to torture blacks in the public square. And they abolished the poll tax. And that last part really set me back, because as a voting rights activist, I went to jail from the White House like 5 times last year, trying to get Biden to have more courage on voting rights. To voting rights activists, I've always been taught that the poll tax was first and foremost, see, you got bumped over or something. Hillary's my big brother, yeah. We're having too much fun. I was always taught that, the poll tax was an attack on black political power, and it disenfranchised 80% of blacks in Virginia. But it also disenfranchised 50% of whites in Virginia. And those two groups, 80% of blacks, 50% of whites, was basically 100% of the populist coalition that less than 20 years earlier, because this was done in 1902, the poll tax was put into the Virginia Constitution in 1902. Well, in the early 1880s, that populist coalition, essentially the poorest half of whites and most blacks, had taken over the Virginia government. The poll tax was as much an attack on a multiracial populist alliance as it was on the black power of Reconstruction.
Very good. If you'll just tell us your name and ask us your question.
Of course. I am Tracy McKissick. I am from Detroit, Michigan. I'm retired high school principal. And I moved here to DC to help my son build generational wealth. And I've just had my very first grandbaby.
Oh, congratulations. And also congratulating his son who's smart enough to follow mom.
We work together. And so, that grandma's love for that first grandbaby boy, I didn't know I could be so in love. But I am also concerned about what kind of world will be there for my grandbaby.
Yeah, preach.
And so he will come of age somewhere in the 2030s, 2040s.
Yeah.
Where they predict climate change to destroy the planet, more species become extinct, and the right-wing supremacists are threatening to destroy, the United States and government. You sound very optimistic. What do you think is going to happen for my grandbaby when I probably will not be here in these 2050?
So I say, Grandma, keep the faith the way that your grandma did. Because if we were here 100 years ago, Rosewood would be a year in front of us. Black Wall Street would be a year after that. And Red Summer would be a year behind us. Black babies have always been born in the midst of what feels like a looming apocalypse. And Grandma always kept the faith. My grandma would tell you, it is true, pessimists are right more often, but optimists win more often. And then she wins, asks me, I'll take winning. She explains because life is like a boxing match. The pessimist gets into the ring in the first round and says, I'm probably going to get knocked down. I'm probably going to get beat up a little. And you know what? It happens in the first round, the second round, the third round, with 3 dots on a graph as a trend. In the 4th round, the pessimist throws in I'm done, y'all. The optimist is like Muhammad Ali in the Rumble of the Jungle. Gets in every round, saying, this might be the round that George Foreman doesn't kick my butt. It's butt kick. Again and again and again. As he approaches the 12th round, he says, this is what I trained for. I just got to be standing in this round and I win the whole thing. That's probably been a little bit of your experience in business. I train entrepreneurs, I've been an entrepreneurs, you got to stay optimistic. Your biggest entrepreneurial investment is like grandbaby's life. Stay optimistic and raise them as Black folks were raised in this country for centuries until about 1970, when for a second we thought we had won every major battle. Raise them to fight. I think I'm most grateful to my grandma is she didn't stop raising her grandbabies to fight just because they had just won a bunch of big battles. Don't stop being optimistic just because there's gray clouds on the horizon.
Good evening, my name is Jasmine Allen. I am a fifth-generation Washingtonian. I went to Howard University currently. I am a grad student at George Washington University.
Excellent. Excellent.
Currently, I work with Planned Parenthood as the Director of Middle School Education. The question I have is that, to your point, my generation will be raising our children under two social guises: the idea of generational wealth and the idea that we live in a post-racial, quote-unquote, society.
Yeah.
Do you think that those can coexist, one acknowledging the other? If you are raising generational wealth, truly and holistically, will we be able to maintain the idea of post-racialism while not understanding what the need for garnering that generational wealth is? Or will it just become meaningless as time goes on?
Interesting. That's a deep question. First of all, thank you for working for Planned Parenthood. These are tough times. We need you. My grandmother worked for Planned Parenthood in the 1940, 41, 42 in Baltimore, Catholic city and a Catholic state, when the founder had recently gotten out of prison for pushing birth control. Thank you. Secondly, what I'm hearing in that is, like, do we need racial identity to sort of somehow inspire us, organize us to create multi-generational wealth? I'd say the answer is no, quite the opposite. With that said, I'm also not advocating for us to like radically shift our identities. I don't know how many different words there have been for Black since I've been African-American, Afro-American, etc., Negro, colored. What I'm saying, though, is that all of us would benefit in society as a whole, well, if we dig and we get to know where specifically in Africa are our folks from. May actually open up new channels for multi-generational wealth. Where specifically in Europe are our people from? What families are we a part of that actually understood in slavery that they were a family no matter how effed up a family they were? That's part of where my family's wealth came from. We came off plantations of people who at the very least helped to remove barriers from my ancestors down in the county clerk's office because of what their last name was and judging by their complexion who their daddy was. The human existence is complicated. Race is oppressively simple. Complexifying it only creates opportunities. And Lord knows it needs to be complexified. When you tell a child that they are Black, simply Black, as my mother's grandmother wrote her a note, you were 100% Negro, baby, never forget it, because my mom dared question the social order because she was in the Philippines where there's a different spin on things. You crush their imagination. But when you say, as I say to my son, well, the Jealouses, this crazy last name, comes from Lincolnshire. They were one of 4 brothers who changed his last name from Jellis to one of the 7 deadly sins in the 16th century. Let's try to figure that one out together. Why would he have done that? When you can say to them, and your mom's dad, well, his X chromosome goes back to the Lemba people of Sierra Leone. Let's study them. And your grandma's X chromosome, it goes right back and like all before to Madagascar, and let's study them. He's still Black. Yes, my little high yellow son, I'm Black and I'm proud. But he owns all of his heritage. And, for the record, when we discovered Thomas Jefferson was our cousin, my son, he said, he's like, Dad, there's so much problematic history there. Can I just call him Cousin TJ? And I was like, whatever you want, son, whatever you want. It's like, I just can't muster the reverence. That was a huge vocabulary for time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is extraordinary. Let me tell you, I'm probably more thrilled than the rest of you are, even though everything is so wonderful to hear. It's an amazing thing. I want to add one last question for you before we kind of close out. One of the things that you seem to point out throughout all of this is that you can't talk about racism without economics.
No, absolutely. And you also can't save the world without ending poverty. You talk about climate change, and I will be the next head of the Sierra Club. I'll be the first Black person to lead a major green movement in America. That starts next month. And what I told the board was this: the day that the future of the planet will be assured is the day that we convince the low-income people, who are like half of humanity, that it's in their short-term financial best interest. The reason that people in West Virginia sign up to support a politician who will blow up the top of their favorite mountain and send it cascading into the stream, destroying it and poisoning it, is because they want the jobs to mine coal. The reason a Central African nation might auction off an entire sacred rainforest is because they're poor, and they're plain about it. What gives me hope at this moment for you, for your grandbaby, I would say, raise that child to dream and code. As soon as they're learning to play the piano, get them learning to program computers. And raise that child to understand that America, for centuries, had a simple formula for creating wealth, massive wealth. It treated entire groups of people, every group of color, and poor whites as well, as disposable. Go look at our prisons if you have any doubts. And it treated our forests and our streams as disposable. But the beautiful thing about right now is that we actually finally have the technologies existing to create more jobs sustaining the planet and saving the planet than destroying it. And that gives real opportunity for creating a more inclusive economy. In fact, it's a necessity. Racism lives, at the end of the day, solving the riddle of racism in our society, moving our society beyond it, as Dr. King instructed us, is the fastest way to end poverty, because you can finally unite folks. And ending poverty, as Pope Francis has said, is the same fight as saving the planet. Thank you. God bless.
A true civil and human rights preacher, because this is a parable of American healing. Give Ben Joseph a huge hand.
Thank you again to everybody for coming. Mr. Ben Jones, thank you for all of that. I was so enraptured.
Oh, thank you.
Really, really about the information, just learning so much more about history from your perspective too, so it was an honor. And Mr. Shelton, an honor to have you here as well, so thank you. Everyone, please go over to this table here, we'll do the book signing, but thank you all for coming tonight as well. And for all of you who are watching online, visit mahoganybooks.com for your copy and for a review of this session tonight. Thank you.
Hey, good to see you.